Grid Road, 40 miles north of the Portage La Prairie Detachment, Manitoba, February 1956, 11:40 in the morning. Corporal George Henderson, Royal Canadian Mounted Police, D Division, 11 years at this posting. Watched the snow moving low across the road surface, 200 yards ahead, and brought the car down to a crawl before the drift became visible through the windshield. He had left detachment radio range about 20 minutes back. From here to the Henderson farm on Section 14, no relation to the corporal, just a name that had been on that land since before the grid road existed. There was no one he could call, and no one who could reach him. The call, relayed before he left, had said family disturbance. In February, at that farm, 3 words did not describe what he was driving into. He knew that before the operator in Winnipeg finished the sentence, because he had been to the Henderson place 14 times in 11 years, and each of those 14 calls had taught him something the file at D Division headquarters did not contain. He knew which stretch of road ahead drifted first in a northwest wind. He knew it because he had been wrong about it once, in February 1947, in his second year at this detachment, and had put a car in the ditch learning it. He knew the culvert crossing at the 12-mile mark took chains once the wind had been running more than 4 hours, and he had checked the wind before he checked anything else that morning. And he knew, from the November call to the same farm, roughly what a February version of the same trouble would look like when he arrived. Who would be talking, who would not be, and what the quiet one in the kitchen would need him to notice without being asked. None of that was in the radio message. All of it was in Henderson, and in nothing else on that road. The operator in Winnipeg had given him a location and 2 words. 11 years at one detachment had given him the 3 other things he actually needed. What were they? And what, exactly, does 11 years at a single rural posting put into an officer that a call from headquarters was never built to carry? The car under Henderson was a 1956 Ford Custom Line. The model D Division ran that year, black-bodied with white front doors and the RCMP shield decal that had replaced painted lettering 2 years earlier. It was a good car for the highway. On a plowed grid road in a moving drift, it was a car that needed a driver who already knew what was under the snow before the snow told him. Winnipeg had radio. The RCMP's first transmitter in Manitoba had gone into service there in 1940, and by 1956, the force had been broadcasting bulletins over the province for the better part of 2 decades. What the force did not yet have, on a rural grid road 40 miles out, was reliable 2-way contact once an officer dropped below the antenna's line of sight into the rolling parkland north of the highway. Coverage was a matter of terrain and distance, not of intention. Past a certain point on the road to Section 14, the radio was dead weight on the dash, and everyone at the detachment knew it. So the institution's plan for what happened next was not a plan at all. It was Henderson. The car could get him there if the road stayed passable. The uniform gave him the authority to act once he arrived. Neither the car nor the uniform could tell him which family situation waited behind the door, or how a Manitoba February changed it. That knowledge did not come from Winnipeg, and it did not travel by radio. It traveled by years. Before we continue, if this kind of documentation is what you've been looking for, consider subscribing. Every video on this channel goes into one specific element of Canadian patrol between 1900 and 1980. The vehicle, the posting, the territory knowledge, that 11 years in one place, built in the officer who drove the same 40 miles in 4 seasons, and the communities those officers served, in the full complexity of what that service meant in this era. Not Mountie mythology. The documented operational and human reality of patrol in a country whose geography required its officers to know their territory the way no centralized system has ever been asked to know it. 11 years on the grid, roads north of Portage La Prairie, gave Corporal Henderson 3 pieces of information about a February call that no radio, no report, and no GPS system has ever been built to carry. And if you served in the RCMP or provincial police in this era, or your family did, put it in the comments. If you or your family served with the RCMP, the OPP, or another provincial force on a rural or northern posting in this era, what is the one thing about your territory that never made it into a written report? Next video, what an RCMP Northern Dog Sled Patrol depended on from Indigenous guides that no patrol manual ever wrote down. Back on the grid road. What the call had not contained. First, that February calls to the Henderson farm in the previous 4 years had all carried a weather component. The family cut off by drift, the pressure of isolation building on a household that had been snowed in for days before anyone could reach them. A February call to that address was never only about what the 2 words said. It was about what 4 winters of the same pattern had already taught him to expect. Second, that the road past the 12-mile culvert drifted in a northwest wind and would need chains if the wind had been running more than 4 hours. And it had been running since 6 that morning. He had learned this the hard way, not the easy way. In February 1947, his second winter at the detachment, he had driven that stretch at his ordinary speed, misjudged how far the drift extended, and put the car into the ditch. He had walked the last 3 miles to a call that was, as it happened, not urgent. But he had never made that misjudgment again. 9 years of driving the same road in the same wind had turned one bad afternoon into permanent knowledge. Third, that he already knew, from the November call to the same farm, roughly what a February version of the same trouble would look like. Not the specific words, but the shape of it. Who would be doing the talking when he arrived? Who would be quiet? And what the quiet one would need him to notice without being asked directly. None of this was procedure. None of it had a line item in a report. It existed because 14 calls over 11 years had each deposited something in him that the previous 13 had not quite completed. D Division kept files. Files recorded what happened after an officer arrived, not what an officer already knew before he did. The dispatcher in Winnipeg who took the call that morning had access to every one of those 14 files if she'd had reason to pull them. She did not have, and could not have had, the version of that knowledge that lived only in the body of the man driving toward it. The version built from being wrong once in 1947 and never wrong again, from 9 winters of reading the same wind on the same road. This is what a long rural posting produced, and what the institution never had a form to record it on. Not a set of facts an officer could recite, but a working familiarity with one specific 40 miles that made the difference, on any given February morning, between arriving prepared and arriving blind. What did the rest of that territory look like through 11 years of eyes? The families beyond Section 14, the town 12 miles the other direction, the community at the far end of the patrol route that Henderson's detachment was also responsible for, and that no amount of driving the grid roads alone could have taught him to understand. The Henderson farm was one call out of hundreds, a rural D Division detachment answered in a year, and Section 14 was 1 square mile out of several hundred the detachment was responsible for. What 11 years had built in Corporal Henderson was not a special memory for one address. It was a working map of the entire area, which was a different thing, and a harder one to explain to anyone who had not built one. He knew which farms had a telephone that worked when the lines were down elsewhere, because a shared party line ran differently, depending on which pole had gone over in the last windstorm. He knew which elevator agent in the nearest grain-handling town kept late hours and would let a stranded traveler wait inside rather than in a car on the highway. He knew that the family 2 sections east of the Hendersons had lost a son at Dieppe, and that a February visit for an unrelated matter needed to account for what that house was still carrying, 12 years on. None of this was written anywhere. It accumulated the way frost builds on a window, one cold night at a time, until the whole pane was covered, and no one who had watched it happen could say exactly which night had done the most. Documented RCMP divisional histories for comparable prairie detachments in this decade describe the same pattern repeating across Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta. A single officer or small detachment covering hundreds of square miles of rural territory, with the posted officer functioning, in practice, as the only continuously updated record the institution had of that territory's specific conditions. The file cabinet in Winnipeg held case reports. Henderson held the working knowledge those reports were built from and could never fully capture, the accumulated, second-nature understanding of a landscape and the people on it that a 10-page report reduced, necessarily, to a fraction of what the officer actually knew when he wrote it. This is what the long rural posting was, underneath the vehicle and the uniform. 11 years of frost building on one pane of glass, one call and one winter at a time, until the officer could read a road, a family, and a community the institution had never asked him to formally learn, because the institution had never built a form for what that learning was. What did that knowledge mean, though, to the people on the other side of it? To the families who knew Henderson by name rather than by badge number, to the small town 12 miles the other direction where he was as much a familiar face as an officer of the law, and to the communities at the far edge of the patrol district whose relationship with the RCMP carried a very different weight. Before Henderson left the detachment that morning, he had already done 4 things that had nothing to do with the call itself. He had checked the block heater had done its job overnight, so the engine would turn over in temperatures that could otherwise leave a battery dead within minutes. He had checked that the shovel, the tow chain, and the wool blankets were in the trunk where they belonged, not because he expected to need them that particular morning, but because the morning he didn't check would be the morning he did. RCMP Gazette records for comparable prairie detachments in this decade document this as standard winter patrol practice. Tire chains, emergency rations, a shovel, and blankets carried as a matter of course, because a car stopped on an open grid road in a Manitoba February was a survival situation measured in hours, not an inconvenience measured in minutes. None of this equipment was unique to Henderson. Every officer at every rural prairie detachment carried some version of it. What was not standard issue was knowing, without having to think about it, which piece of equipment a specific stretch of a specific road was going to require on a specific morning. The chains for the 12-mile crossing, the extra 15 minutes of idle time before departure because this car's battery ran weaker than the last one, the decision to top off the fuel tank the night before, rather than trust it would still be open at the filling station on the way back. A first-year officer at this detachment learned these things by being cold, by being stuck, by being late. Henderson had been all 3, years ago, and had built each lesson into a habit so automatic he no longer experienced it as a decision at all. This is what 11 years at one posting does, that a training manual cannot. It turns knowledge into instinct, and it does so by means the institution never designed and never tracked. By cold mornings, wrong guesses, and the accumulated weight of having been the only person responsible for getting home. What Henderson carried into that car was not a checklist. It was a decade of checklists, compressed into a set of reflexes that operated faster than thought, and that would leave the detachment with him the day he did. But none of that territory knowledge, the roads, the weather, the equipment, existed apart from the people it was built to serve. What did 11 years on that same 40 miles mean to the families who watched for his car, to the small town where he was as familiar a face as the postmaster, and to the communities further out whose relationship to the uniform he wore carried a very different history? To the Henderson family and the dozen others like them scattered across the detachment's territory, Corporal Henderson was not primarily an instrument of law enforcement. He was the person who showed up. Over 11 years and 14 calls to one address, the relationship between an RCMP officer and a farm family 40 miles from the nearest detachment became something closer to a known, if infrequent, presence in the community's life than a purely institutional one. The officer who had been there the winter the barn roof came down, who knew the children's names and how old they were now, who could be trusted to notice a situation without needing it explained from the beginning. In the small town 12 miles the other direction, the relationship was even more constant. A detachment covering a town of 300 or 400 people put the same 1 or 2 officers in the general store, at the rink, at the church supper, week after week, for years. RCMP divisional histories and comparable provincial police records for small prairie towns in this era describe this as a defining feature of the posting. The constable who knew the town well enough that a great many disputes never became a formal call at all, because he was already a known quantity to both sides before he arrived, and his presence alone sometimes did the work that formal intervention would otherwise have had to do. This closeness was not without its complications. A constable who knew everyone in a town of 400 people also had to enforce the law against people he knew personally, sat beside at church, or owed a favor to. A set of pressures that documented histories of small detachment policing described candidly as one of the genuine difficulties of the posting, not a romantic footnote to it. The same knowledge that let Henderson read a family's situation without being told also meant he could never fully separate himself, the way an anonymous officer arriving from outside the community could, from the people he was there to police. What the farm families in the small town had in common was this. They knew Henderson, specifically, and had built a relationship with him across 11 years that would not simply transfer to whoever came after him. But not every community in that patrol district related to the RCMP the same way. What did the same institution, the same uniform, the same red surge, the same detachment structure, mean to the communities at the district's edge, whose history with the force was shaped by a very different set of policies? Before you can understand what the RCMP meant to the indigenous communities near the far edge of a prairie detachment's territory in this era, you need to understand what the force had been asked to do in those communities for the previous 3 decades, and that this was not a separate history from the one this video has been documenting. It was the same institution, in the same years, wearing the same uniform. Under the 1920 amendment to the Indian Act, RCMP officers were legally designated truant officers for the Indian residential school system. Documented RCMP in government records, and the force's own 2011 internal report on the subject, describe officers being called on by Indian agents to compel school attendance, to locate and return children who had run from those schools, and in some cases, to fine or arrest parents who resisted. In this same period, federal policy under the Indian Act also restricted and, for long stretches, banned indigenous ceremonial and cultural practices, enforcement of which fell in part to the same force. A community's most common direct experience of the RCMP, in many parts of Canada in the decades this video covers, was not a patrol car checking on a stranded traveler. It was an officer arriving in connection with one of these policies. This is documented, institutional fact, not incidental to the subject of this video. It is part of what the uniform meant, in this era, to a significant number of the people it encountered. At the same time, and without this history canceling it out, RCMP northern operations in these same decades, the dog sled patrols, the winter travel, the detachments in country an outside officer could not safely navigate alone, depended directly on indigenous knowledge the force did not have and could not quickly acquire. Well into the 1950s, indigenous men were hired by the RCMP as special constables specifically for their skill with dog teams and their knowledge of the land. Their expertise was, in the most literal operational sense, what allowed those patrols to function at all. The same institution that enforced residential school attendance also could not run a winter patrol north of the settled prairie without the people it was enforcing that policy against. Manitoba's own winter road network into isolated northern communities was still years away in 1956. The first formal winter roads into the far north were cut in the late 1950s, and it was Ontario's provincial force, the OPP, not the RCMP, that had jurisdiction over the parallel network reaching into northwestern Ontario's Indigenous communities in the decades that followed. Both forces, in their own provinces, occupied the same double position, the institution a remote community depended on for winter access and emergency response, and the institution that had enforced federal Indigenous policy against that same community within living memory. Neither fact erases the other. The genuine operational knowledge this video has spent 5 blocks documenting existed inside an institution that was, in these same years, actively harming the communities at the edge of its own patrol district. Both are the historical record. What changed over the following 2 decades about how this institution communicated with its officers, deployed them, and eventually replaced the kind of long, deeply local posting that had produced everything Henderson knew about his 40 miles of grid road? The RCMP had been broadcasting radio bulletins into Manitoba since 1938 and running its own transmitter out of Winnipeg since 1940. What changed across the 2 decades after Henderson's 1956 patrol was not the existence of radio but its reach. More transmitters, more repeater coverage, and eventually 2-way sets reliable enough that a rural patrol car could expect to stay in contact with its detachment for most of a normal shift, not just the first 20 minutes off the highway. This was a genuine institutional improvement, and it is worth stating plainly. An officer who can call for help from a stranded car on an open grid road in February is safer than one who cannot. Nobody documenting this era should wish otherwise for the individual officer standing beside a disabled patrol car in the cold. But better radio coverage answered a different question than the one Henderson's 11 years had answered. Radio could tell a dispatcher where a car was. It could not tell the officer in that car which stretch of road ahead had drifted first in a northwest wind for the last 9 winters, or what a February call to a specific address was actually likely to mean. That knowledge had never traveled by radio, in 1956 or afterward, because it had never been the kind of thing a radio call was built to carry. Through the 1960s, as reliable rural radio coverage expanded, and centralized dispatch systems consolidated call-taking away from individual detachments and into larger regional centers, a second and related change was underway. The RCMP and provincial forces across Canada began consolidating small rural detachments into larger, multi-community districts, patrolled by rotating officers rather than the single long-posted corporal, a town, or a stretch of grid road, had known for a decade. Documented divisional histories describe this consolidation as driven by real operational logic. Fewer, better-staffed detachments were more efficient to run, easier to supply, and less dependent on any one individual's continuous presence. What this change gave the institution was resilience, coverage that did not disappear the day a single officer transferred, retired, or fell ill. What it could not give the institution, no matter how good the radio or how well run the district office, was a replacement for the specific thing 11 years at one posting had built in Corporal Henderson. A working, embodied familiarity with one particular 40 miles that no rotation schedule was designed to reproduce, and no radio channel was built to transmit. Corporal Henderson retired from the Portage-La Prairie detachment in 1962, 17 years after he had arrived there as a young constable who did not yet know which stretch of grid road drifted first in a northwest wind. The detachment itself was folded into a 3-detachment district operation in 1969, part of the broader consolidation documented across RCMP and provincial police divisional histories through the late 1960s and 1970s. Larger districts, rotating officers, radio and eventually computer-assisted dispatch, replacing the single posted corporal as the institution's working memory of a territory. What consolidation gave the RCMP was real: flexible deployment, lower cost per detachment, a district patrol car that could reach 3 times the territory one corporal used to cover alone, and officers who no longer risked being genuinely unreachable 20 minutes off the highway. These were not small improvements, and this video is not arguing they should have been refused. What consolidation did not give the grid road north of Portage-La Prairie was an officer who knew, without needing to check, which section drifted first in a northwest wind. The patrol car that answered a call to the old Henderson territory in February 1970 found the address from a map. It got there. It did not arrive already knowing the 3 things that call would not have contained, because the officer driving it had been at the district posting for 14 months, not 11 years, and no map has ever recorded what those 11 years put into a man. If this channel is going to keep documenting what Canadian patrol officers knew about their territories, and what it cost the institution when that knowledge left with them, subscribe. There are more grid roads, more northern detachments, more dog sled crossings, more family calls with 3 pieces of information the dispatch could not have contained, and none of it was ever asked to write itself down. 11 years on the grid roads north of Portage-La Prairie gave one corporal 3 pieces of information about a February call that no radio, no report, and no GPS system built since has ever been asked to carry. And if you have a patrol route, a posting, a winter road, or a detachment in your own family's history, put it in the comments. If you or your family served with the RCMP, the OPP, or another provincial force on a rural or northern posting in this era, what is the one thing about your territory that never made it into a written report? Next video: what an RCMP Northern Dog Sled Patrol depended on from Indigenous guides that no patrol manual ever wrote down. Nobody had asked Corporal Henderson what those 3 things were before he went home for the last time in 1962. The grid road north of Portage-La Prairie still drifts the same way in a northwest wind. The map has not changed. The knowledge is somewhere else now.